Alrighty, so this is the last section of Slopes of War. Wait, oh, never mind. Sorry, I saw that there was two people in this, and then I realized the second person is me sharing. Okay. Anywho, so this is the last section of Slopes of War. So I hope you guys enjoy, and that you've enjoyed it thus far. All right, so last time Buck was having to deal with having only one leg and trying to stay alive. Becca was worried about her family and that her loved ones are dying. She was helping the wounded. There's that general who is who she's trying to kind of nurse back to health. Curtis was found in a trench, or anyway, he was in a trench, and then he retreated, and then we know that he got shot. We don't know if he's alive or not. And then we finally got to hear from Mason. He is fighting. He got captured, and it looks like the Union won. So that is where we're at. This is very zoomed in. Don't know if it's supposed to look like that. All right, here we're gonna try something. Hold on. Okay. Sorry, thank you for your patience, guys. Okay. Oh my gosh. Exit. Let's try this again. There we go. Okay. So yeah, so it looks like we've won, and General Lee was generally pretty sad for seeming to have lost. Okay. So July 4th and after, chapters 22 through 24. 22. Leander came into Becca's room and wakened her soon after midnight. There was a big commotion going on outside, he told her. Something strange was happening. They stood at the open parlor window, straining to see what it was. Officers with lanterns were passing back and forth, talking quietly to the soldiers bivouacked in front of the houses along the street. There was the sound of horses moving and wagons bumping off into the darkness. Rebs are leaving, Leander whispered. Maybe this time for good. Becca thought of Curtis. He had promised to come back, and she was sure that he would keep his promise. She went back to bed. Later she wakened again, this time to the sound of fife and drum. Pulling a wrapper out on over her nightdress, she lit a lamp and went to the top of the stairs. A voice called from Buck's room. Becca? Adam Waite was sitting up in bed. What's going on? It's Yankee Doodle, Captain. I thought that's what it was. Help me, please. I want to see. She helped him from the bed and supported him as he walked slowly toward the window. The fresh smell of rain blew into the room through the broken panes. Below, they saw a dark procession winding through a misty dawn, a flag held high. Those are our men, Becca cried. That's our flag. Then it's our fight. Happily, awkwardly, the captain's arm tightened around her shoulders. We've won, Becca. Thank God it's over. He was a tall man and muscular, but she felt the trembling weakness shivering through his body. It's the 4th of July, he said, and it's my 16th birthday, she remembered. A Union soldier pounded on the door in the early afternoon. Rain beat down heavily upon his head and shoulders and dripped steadily from the peak of his forage cap. I'm looking for, he glanced at a damp envelope that he held in his hand. Miss Rebecca Summerhill? Come in, please. I'm Becca. No, miss, I have a report to make in town, but your house was on my way, and I thought you'd want to have this. He had a rough, round, friendly face. I've been on burial detail this morning at Culp's Hill. He was stammering now, anxious to finish, and I came across one of those poor fellows, and this letter was in his pocket. Sorry. He held it toward her. Well, as you can see, miss, it's for you. Burial detail? She did not touch the envelope. She looked down and saw his thick, wet boots standing in a puddle of water on the doorstep. Then she looked up into his kind, slow, blinking eyes. My cousin was at Culp's Hill, but he's coming back to see me. I've been waiting for him. The soldier glanced away, then back at her. The rebels left us lots of work to do. We're digging trenches to bury the dead they left behind. You see, that way we can bury 40 or 50 at a time. His words stumbled off and stopped. He tapped her arm gently with the letter, asking her to take it. Slowly, her fingers closed around it. You're telling me that my cousin is dead? I'm sorry, miss. Are you going back up there? As soon as I make my report, and I want to go with you. Oh, I wouldn't let you do that. He backed away. It's not a sight you'd want to see, not a pretty young lady like you. No, miss, I couldn't take you there. Then I'll go alone. They won't let you up there today. It's no use trying. She looked at him, her mind elsewhere, busy, planning, trying to slide away from what he had just told her. I have some clothes that I can wear, and nobody will even notice me in all this rain. Just tell me where to find my cousin, please. He hesitated and then gave in. Wait for me here. I'll be back soon, and I'll take you with me. She was ready when he came, wearing Adam Waite's torn and blood-stained jacket, and his trousers held up with a belt. Her hair was piled up under his officer's hat, and she wore tall boots stuffed with rags in the toes to help make them fit. You shouldn't do this, the soldier said. Really, you shouldn't. I have to know where Curtis is. Becca's face was cold and determined. You're not responsible for me. Just lead the way, and I'll follow. Overhead, dark clouds dragged low above the rooftops. Rain spewed from eaves, rushed and gurgled noisily in the street as men in uniform pushed past in both directions, paying no attention as she dogged through the clutter of bodies, spilled wreckage, sodden coats and caps, dead horses, and abandoned wagons. Then she was climbing over a barricade and splashing out along the muddy pike. In minutes she was soaked through, the big hat flapping down around her ears, water leaking down her back, the two large boots sloshing painfully at her heels. The blurred, rounded mass of Culp's Hill rose ahead through the downpour. Picnics and childish games, and Curtis running, climbing, pulling her up the grassy slope. He'd had a way of finding tiny, hidden things, the smallest bird's eggs that a breath might crush, the jeweled glitter of a ladybug, a wildflower crouched beneath a leaf. She remembered the bright blue flicker of his eyes. This was all a mistake. Curtis was not dead. He was the most alive, the most life-loving person that she knew. Now they were climbing. She hugged her body with both arms to stop the trembling. Are you all right? The soldier asked, waiting for her to catch up. She nodded. It looks as if the world ends here, she said. Trees, riddled white by thousands of mini balls, were peeled naked poles stuck like spears into the dead flank of the hill. Branches dangled, were littered everywhere. She would not look at the soaked, dull blue and earth-colored bundles that lay heaped across the melting ground. There was the sharp scrape of metal. Men were striking at dirt with shovels, bending, scooping, heaving. A row of bodies lay nearby, upturned faces washed clean in the rain. At the top of the hill, the soldiers stopped and gestured. Beneath a shattered clump of pines was a long, fresh mound, the raw, wet earth spaded over. He's here, miss, at the end. I buried him myself. He was the last one in. This was the truth of war, death. All the words and the speeches and the sentimental songs meant nothing to her now. Only this was real. Curtis was dead. She believed it. She had seen war face to face, heard it, smelled it, tasted its bitter smoke. Now she touched it, bending to pick up a broken branch, wrapped it with her handkerchief. Carefully, she marked the place where Curtis Walker lay. Thank you. She held out her hand, gripped the soldier's fingers with her own. I won't forget your kindness. Thank you. He watched her go back down the streaming hillside, an awkward, shapeless figure in the two large boots, dignified by grief. My dearest Becca, in a little while we are going up the hill, and if I come down again, there'll be no need to send this letter. If I don't come back, then maybe it will find its way to you. Becca, I never saw anyone as lovely as you looked last night. You're not a girl at all, but a grown woman now, and I feel as if I've lost something and found something both at the same time. Do you remember the night that you and Buck and I crawled out the cellar window and the three of us went up on Little Round Top in the moonlight? You knew that your folks would have had a holy fit if they had found out, but once you made up your mind to go, there was no stopping you. And we lay there, curled up in our blankets, talking for hours, and I recall how small I felt with those millions of stars shining over our heads, and I said we were only tiny parts of something too big to believe, and you said yes, but very important parts all the same. I like that. You have always been a very important part of my life. That night on Round Top, when you fell asleep, I stayed awake and watched over you, and it was the very best time of my life until last night when I was kissing you. Your own, Curtis. Chapter 23. Buck had prayed for water to cool the fever and quench his terrible thirst, and then it came at last. A fine, misty drizzle at the start, then cold, needling strokes, then the deluge that punched across parched acres, soaking deep into the ground, brimming in the hollows, filling dry creek beds to overflowing. Helpless men, trapped in the low-lying places, cried out to be moved, terrified of drowning. Buck! Buck Summerhill! 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 That it was his own name, tumbling over and over in his mind. Sometimes it sounded louder and nearer, then it floated off and disappeared. He had tried to get up, to crawl to some protected spot, but he was too weak from hunger and loss of blood. His corner of the field was heaped with soldiers, most of them silent now, oblivious. No warmth or comfort here. He was alone, soaked through and violently shaking, chilled to the heart. Buck! Buck Summerhill! Here. The word was too small, barely a whisper. He tried again. Here I am. Over here. But his voice was washed away in the windy gusts of water that lashed in waves across the field. He listened. Thunder banged heavily overhead, but he did not hear his name called again. Then he was in the house on Baltimore Street, going up the stairs, his legs almost too tired to move. He went into his room and with a great effort climbed up into the bed. Quilts fluttered over him, surrounded him. He was warm and safe in his own place, and at last he could sleep. Felt the deep, soft feather mattress sink beneath him, taking him down and down. Buck! He did not want to open his eyes. Someone was shaking him, forcing him to stay awake. An arm slipped around his upper body and lifted him. Buck! Come on, Buck! My face stared down at him. Come on, Buck! Tully said. We're going home. Others were also going home. Throughout the long, dark, sullen afternoon, through the steady hiss and military rattle of the rain, Lee had waited to see what the Union commander would do. By nightfall, he knew there would be no attack. As then, he pulled his troops off the ridge and started the long procession homeward through the mountain passes. Soldiers, wagons, prisoners, jostling ambulances, 17 miles of misery, retreating through mud and storms towards Virginia. Meade sent a joyful message to the president. The result of the battle was glorious, the enemy utterly baffled and defeated. He would look to the army for greater efforts to drive from our soil every vestige of the presence of the invader. Those words annoyed and offended a deeply worried Abraham Lincoln. Driving the enemy away was not the way to end the conflict. It would only prolong it. The rebel forces must be destroyed before the war could be ended and the great issues settled. Time and time again, Lincoln had tried to persuade the military minds to see it his way. Yet no one, except perhaps the stubborn general who had besieged Vicksburg and won it on the same day the Gettysburg battle had ended, had been able to grasp what was so simple and so obvious to the burdened president. General Meade must go after Lee and smash the Army of Northern Virginia. But the Union commander was slow to react. His losses, 23,000 dead, wounded, or missing, were enormous. How could soldiers who had given so much be asked to give even more? And even though the limping Southern army must have suffered just as much, it would always be dangerous. After a cautious interval, the general stalked the enemy warily, putting his troops between the Confederates and Washington, but taking no foolish chances. Days later, when Meade had finally decided it was time to strike, Lee, who was one jump ahead, leaped the Potomac with his men and escaped. The town swelled, groaning with casualties. Churches, schools, private houses, barns, outbuildings, stores, and warehouses, Gettysburg College and the seminary building were jammed with patients, and still they kept coming in from the battlefield, badly shattered men needing medical treatment, food and shelter, and a kindly human touch. You can't go back to the hospital without some rest. Becca was worried about her mother, who was spending most of her time with the wounded soldiers. Dr. Horner told me you were to stay quiet. She did not mention the nerves. Mrs. Summerhill seemed to have forgotten all about them, and Becca hoped that they had gone for good. I need to be there. Lydia Summerhill was dressed to go out, and every time a man is brought in, I look to make sure it isn't Buck or Tully or one of your cousins. Becca hadn't told her mother yet about Curtis. She had put the knowledge of his death away on a dark shelf in her mind. Later, there would be time for them to mourn, to take him to the family plot on Cemetery Hill. She was sure that would be what Aunt Mercy would want them to do. It's odd how many of the Southern boys remark how they can't believe how people here in Gettysburg treat them just as we do our own. Her mother said, but of course we do. When someone is hurting, it isn't blue or gray or any color at all. He's one of the family, isn't that so? Yes, it was so. Already the house was full of the injured from both armies. Caring for them would take all of their energy. There was no room here for hate. The Montforts went to the railroad station to help, Mrs. Summerhill said, and young Mary Elizabeth found her own father lying there with a hole in his side. He'd been hit by a shell. Well, her mother told her to go home quick and take care of her grandma and her sister, but Mary Elizabeth knew that he was dying. What an awful shock for the poor little thing. Leander came into the kitchen, his arms heaped with old bed linens to be used for bandages. The Rebs killed Owen Robinson's pigs. Charles feels bad about it, but they didn't find his slingshot. They didn't find the cow hidden in the parlor either, Becca said. But the way this town's been shaken, the Snyders will be getting butter from her now instead of milk. Leander didn't even smile. Today is the 4th of July, he said sadly. Just a few days ago, Charles and I were wishing we could make some noise to celebrate. I think we've had all the noise we can stand, said his mother. We'll do our celebrating some other time. I don't even care about it. It doesn't matter anymore. Oh, Rebecca, Mrs. Summerhill put her arms around her daughter and hugged her. It's your birthday. That doesn't seem important either, Becca told her, but I know it's a day that I'll never forget. She helped carry the linen down the hall and opened the door. The street was filled with Union soldiers. 2 men walked slowly towards the house, the taller man supporting the other, the soldier with his legs cut off at the knee. So many, too many, her mother whispered. Breaks my heart to see these youngsters maimed like that, crippled for life. Becca still couldn't see the faces clearly, and yet something about the soldier held her attention, kept her there, staring at them. Then she knew. It's Buck! That's Tully helping him! She ran toward them. Buck, you're home! Thank God you're home! Standing on the doorstep, Mrs. Summerhill began to cry. After. Chapter 24. November 19th, 1863. It was a day in late November, a day alive with sunshine, the sky a clean and vivid blue. There was a snap and a clarity to the air that reminded Becca, wrapped in a warm woolen shawl, that winter would soon huddle down from the north. I wish it would snow. She moved with the crowd strolling out along Baltimore Turnpike. Buck, still accustomed to his wooden leg, swung awkwardly ahead, apart from the rest, just out of reach of her voice. Becca hurried to catch up with him. I wish it would snow for days and days and cover up the streets and houses and everything out there until it was all hard and white and frozen stiff, so it would look as if nothing had happened here, nothing at all. Something did happen. Sometimes Buck spoke so softly it was hard to understand him. Snow won't change anything. Nothing will be the same here again. Don't you know that? He was right. She did know it. The war had come and rolled over them and rumbled away, leaving Gettysburg a different place than it had been before. Even the people had changed. Everyone seemed older, sadder too. Maybe that was what she had wanted, the blankness and purity of fresh snow to whiten the dark sadness of the town. So many have come, said Mrs. Summerhill, impressed by the size of the crowd. And imagine someone as famous as Mr. Everett coming here to speak to us at the dedication ceremony. I hate long, boring speeches, Becca said. I only came to see President Lincoln. I've already seen him, Leander, walking behind with Charles McCurdy, kept bumping into his sister, sending her hoop skirt swinging. He came out of Mr. Willis's house last night at the Diamond when everyone was calling for him, but I couldn't hear what he said. He said, Go home, little boy, it's past your bedtime, Becca teased. He did not, but he had this funny, high voice. Leander made a squeaky voice in his throat. I heard him. He was nice. He smiled and was friendly, but he didn't have a speech to make just then. Charles was a good mimic. He stretched himself taller, hollowed his cheeks, stroked an imaginary beard. He said, In my position, it is sometimes important that I should not say foolish things. And the man behind me yelled, if you can help it. That was very unkind, said Mrs. Summerhill. It upset her when people said cruel things about Abraham Lincoln or printed them in the newspapers. I'm surprised he even found the time to travel with so much on his mind, and to think the committee didn't even give him a special invitation at first. It was only when they knew he planned on being here that they invited him to say a few words. But then I don't suppose anyone ever thought he would come, a busy man like that with all his worries. She looked around her at the men, women, and children streaming along the road. or so many thousand of people, and so many soldiers. It was all the men in the uniform that surprised Becca. Men on crutches or with empty coat sleeves pinned up, or like Buck, hobbling along on artificial legs. Why would they want to come back and be reminded? Maybe they need to know what happened here and why, Buck said. Don't they already know? She asked him. I used to think I knew. His voice was so low that Becca leaned closer to catch his words. Now I wonder. I wonder about a lot of things these days. She had been close to her brother once, but that had changed too, ever since he had come home from the battle. Being friends with him seemed long ago, in another time. So much had happened since. Soon after General Lee had retreated, the Union Army had gone away too, taking surgeons and medical attendants with it, leaving thousands of casualties in Gettysburg. Quickly, the town had filled with people, anxious mothers and fathers and wives and children, all worried and searching. The sanitary and Christian commissions had arrived with supplies and support. Hospital tents had been set up and staffed, and for many weeks all the public buildings and private homes had been filled with the wounded and with the relatives who came to visit them. Buzzards came too, ugly and sinister birds that circled slowly in the sky before they dropped to devour what they could scavenge. For weeks a tainted decay hovered over the country, and not even chloride of lime, thickly scattered, could cover the sickening odor. There were flies, millions of them, an illness caused by pestilence. Citizens died from it. Strangers kept arriving more and more every day, wanting to wade through the great dead valley in search of mementos, as if they hoped to make their own lives bigger and more important by carrying away a piece of what had happened in the fields of Gettysburg. Tully had gone back to Erie to be with his folks. Buck had gone to see him, but when he came back, all he would say was that a part of Tully Willard was still missing, and he was not sure his friend would ever be completely whole again. Captain Waite had recovered and gone home to Batavia to marry his sweetheart. He had written a warm note to thank the Summerhills, but he had not mentioned his wedding, and Becca didn't want to know about it anyway. She had the feeling that Anna would trouble the man for the rest of his life. Now there was a disturbance going on along the road, guns firing in the distance, and the quick, bright thump of a marching band. People were stopping, pressing back against the broken fences, unmended since the days of the battle. It's the parade! Here it comes! Charles shouted. Columns of soldiers passed by in a blur of crashing brass and strident trumpets and the booming blows of a big bass drum. Look! Leander was hopping up and down. Look who's coming! Buck barely noticed the important flanking officials. His attention was focused on a striking figure on horseback. It was a worn-looking man with deep-set, shadowed eyes, bony wrists sticking out from the sleeves of a Prince Albert coat, long legs almost dragging on the ground. He was not like other politicians Buck had seen, riding the adulation of a cheering crowd. This one slumped forward, swaying through a melancholy landscape of his own, unaware of all the curious faces staring at him. Stark, isolated, lonely. It was as if some hidden grief within him weighed him down. That's how I feel, Buck thought. He looks the way I feel inside. Voices called out, Mr. President! On to Richmond, Mr. President! We're with you all the way! There were more enthusiastic cheers and a warm rustle of clapping hands. Abraham Lincoln returned from the distant place where he had been, lifted an arm, a smile touched the corner of his lips as he nodded at the spectators, touching them with his keen and friendly glance. His eyes met Buck's with kindness, and his smile deepened at the sight of Mrs. McCullen's 5-month-old baby, heavily bundled and furiously roaring, held up for him to admire. Buck often thought of Jeanie Wade, who had never known that her sweetheart, Jack, had died soon after he was wounded at Winchester. The president passed out of sight. Farther along, a high rise of land gave a sweeping view of the battlefield. Here, close to the place where the Louisiana Tigers had been thrown back on the night of July 2nd, 17-acre site had been set aside for a national cemetery to honor the dead. Crews had been busy for weeks, digging graves in a semicircle, burying soldiers by states, with a small and simple headstone for each man. The place had also been designated for a permanent monument to be raised later. A low wooden platform draped with bunting had been erected for the dedication ceremony. By the time the Summerhills reached the area, there was a vast, shifting, murmuring mass of 15,000 people. Buck disappeared among the crowd, and minutes later, Becca saw that he had worked his way up to the front of the platform. The stage was filled with officials, military men, cabinet members, and state governors. The president was seated on a low settee with Secretary of State Seward on his left, and an empty space was reserved for the famous guest speaker who had not yet arrived. Becca caught a glimpse of Tilly Pierce among the spectators. Something had finally happened to Tilly. During the battle, when she had been trapped on the Weirkrude farm out near the Round Tops, she had carried water to the wounded men and talked to General Weed in the cellar of the house just before he died. One day, she said, she would write it all down. Besides her, ribbons bouncing with excitement, was the little Beaufort girl, who was Mary Elizabeth, who had found her own father dying at the railroad station. There were hundreds of stories. Everyone in Gettysburg had one to tell. Becca thought that perhaps someday she would write about those vivid days herself. 11 o'clock, 11:15, 11:30. The ceremony was half an hour late, and word passed that Mr. Everett was still touring the battlefield, preparing his address. The idea, fussed Mrs. Summerhill, keeping the president waiting. On stage, officials whispered among themselves and went away and hurried back. Only Mr. Lincoln seemed composed and good-tempered as he looked out into the restless crowd. Men and women fidgeted, stamping their feet and rubbing their chilled hands to keep warm. Hungry babies were jingling up and down. It was now 11:45. Mrs. Summerhill's cheeks flamed with cold and her nose burned, a red and indignant dot. I can't imagine who this Mr. Everett thinks he is, she fumed. Famous or not, he's being downright disrespectful. Shortly before 12, Leander ran up. Mr. Burns says he's been invited to meet Abraham Lincoln later on, and he's been bragging about all the things he's going to tell him about fighting in the battle, and Mrs. Burns says it's a pity that only his head has grown so big, and not the rest of him. Becca laughed. Then she saw someone. Mother, over there, near Mrs. McCurdy. Who is it? Isn't that Captain Waite? Mrs. Summerhill, nearsighted from her needlework, squinted into the distance, then shook her head. He looks familiar, but I couldn't say for sure. I'm going to go and see. It took some time to get there, pushing, wriggling in and out of the crowd. Becca finally reached a tall, bearded man in a cavalry uniform, standing with his arms folded across his broad chest. When she did reach his side, she felt suddenly shy and unsure of herself. Captain Waite? There was no doubt that he recognized her, or that he was very pleased to see her. Becca Summerhill! I thought it was you, she told him. I'm happy to see you looking so well. I'm very well, thanks to you good people. In fact, I'll be reporting back for duty in a week or so. He smiled down at her. I plan to pay a call on you after the ceremony. Then you must stay to dinner with us. You did get my letter, the one that I wrote from Botvia? She nodded. I had hoped you would write to me, Becca. Keep in touch? She didn't know what to tell him, how confused and difficult those long days had been during the summer and into the fall when everyone in town had set aside their own lives to care for the casualties. The Summerhills had had men in the house until the end of October, and the last wounded soldier had left Gettysburg only a few days ago. There had been so many things to do, so many details to attend to. They had buried Curtis in the family plot in the Evergreen Cemetery, among the rows of broken tombstones that had been smashed during the battle. She had written his epitaph herself, at rest in the far land of peace. It still hurt to go there, to put wildflowers on his grave, to think of him. They had heard from Mason, who was in a northern prison on Johnson Island in Lake Erie, and they had sent him parcels full of nourishing food, hoping to keep him alive. Your friend Anna, she said, she must be pleased to have had you at home all these months. Anna married while I was away. I was surprised and hurt, but that's all over now. I'm sorry. Becca was indignant that the woman had mistreated this decent man. And you're going back into the army? Do you think the war will last much longer, Captain? Yes, it probably will. General Grant is going to wear out Lee's men and grind down the South, no matter how long it takes, and I believe it will cost us all a great deal. But there seems to be no other way. There was, at last, a motion of beginning on the platform. Becca saw that a dignified man with long white hair and a confident face had taken his place beside the president. I'd better get back to my mother now. No, stay with me, Becca. I need you here. Smiling, he put out his hand, cupping them around the red blaze of her hair, pretending to warm them. And if the crowd gets really restless, you can entertain us with 20 or 30 courses of the Union forever. Do you remember that first day I saw you? I remember every day with you. 2 hours later, Edward Everett was still speaking, but Becca, who had lost all track of time, would not have noticed if he had talked away the afternoon. Buck had taken a place directly in front of the platform. He had stood there, chilly and uncomfortable, as the orator spoke to the attentive crowd in silvery phrases that soared and dazzled, melting off into the sparkling autumn air. Buck listened carefully. The words told him about a battle that had occurred in the fields and woods of Gettysburg, but they didn't tell him what it had meant, or why it had mattered. For a long time he felt that his manhood, with all its warm, strong feelings, had crumbled away, that his heart and body and bones and blood were dry as dust. He still felt that way. He wondered why he had come. Applause lifted and sank and lifted higher in thick approval waves. Gleaming with success, Mr. Everett sat down. The Baltimore Glee Club sang an anthem specifically written for the dedication. Quickly, the President of the United States was introduced to make a few final remarks. The tall, dark man stood up and stepped forward. He spoke quietly and briefly for 2 or 3 minutes, and when he had finished, a polite, scattered response rippled out through the crowd. It had been a long, tiring ceremony, and everyone was ready to go home. Voices rose majestically as the chorus sang, "Oh, it is sweet for our country to die," and it was over. Officials bobbed busily about the platform, shaking hands, talking enthusiastically as people streamed away into the bright November sunlight, eager to get home to warm houses and hot dinners. Buck stood, unable to move, his eyes on the brooding face of the man who had just spoken. For months he had asked himself hard questions about the great thing he had been a part of. The struggle he had once believed in had become a puzzle to him, had seemed at times a tragic waste. Now, in simple and direct and truthful words, this sad-eyed man had given him its meaning. The battle fought during these hot days in July had mattered, and every life lost here had mattered too. On these slopes of war, men had paid in blood and sacrifice so that the bright winged spirit of the nation could be kept alive, and the beautiful word freedom passed on as a gift to all the generations that would follow. He knew by his look of disappointment that the tall man realized that what he had just said had not been grasped or understood or believed. Buck wished he could reassure him in some way that the little speech, so large with meaning, had not been a failure. The concept of liberty would always baffle and elude and challenge the human mind. But what Abraham Lincoln had said was something that he would remember for the rest of his life. The president came down the wooden steps. The little Montfort girl, bright-faced and expectant, smiled up at him. "Hello, young lady. Who are you?" "I'm Mary Elizabeth." He bent, scooped up her tiny hand. For the second time that day, his eyes met Buck. "Thank you," the boy said. "Thank you, Mr. President." Then he turned and moved away, a lonely figure limping off along the thinning crowd. What was said? This is going to be Abraham Lincoln's speech, which is known as the Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in the larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember, what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to that great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. All right, so that's the end of the whole book. And I don't know about you guys, but I have goosebumps. That was intense. Yeah, I'm sad we didn't get to read this book together as a class. I think we could have really had some great discussions on it, but I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you guys want to do a Google chat to talk about it, that would be awesome. I miss you guys a lot, and I hope you're doing okay in quarantine. So I guess in these chapters, Becca was grieving for Curtis. Buck managed to hold on to life, and really just everyone is trying to cope with the emotional and physical loss and damage of the war. And Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, which I think it's interesting that he says that, that the world won't long remember what was said there. We do, because it was pretty powerful. And I don't know if you guys caught, they talked about how Lincoln was so kind of grieved. He lost family members in the war, and it was honestly like the war was killing him emotionally. So, yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. And so tomorrow, listen to those songs and look at those pictures I posted on our slideshow. And next week, we're going to go back in time a little, and we're going to talk from the beginning of the war. And then we'll go through the whole thing. So, yeah, I miss you guys. You guys are awesome. And I will talk to you later. All right.